Back in the 1980s, I attended an elite private high school in New York City, where we were keenly aware that we were all operating in a competitive learning environment. My experience of the school wasn't that it was cutthroat, but that we were all aware that while we were friends, we were also competitors. And when push came to shove, the colleges that we were applying to, many of us to the same schools, would see that we were elbowing each other out for a limited number of spots. And the same dynamic unfolded again when I was teaching in the US Navy in the 90s, when students were competing for ROTC and NROTC scholarships, often with a great deal on the line, having relocated their families and having a relatively limited set of choices that would work for their lives. These students were peers and colleagues and friends, but they were also in competition with one another for these scholarships. So recently, when I read about a study examining some of the social dynamics around the use of AI, it raised my curiosity. Hello, and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder and chief academic officer here at Newsella, and I use AI as a thinking partner in preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So, a research study published in June by researchers at Pusan National University in South Korea examined how social comparison, which they define as that constant measuring of yourself against others, drives problematic AI use among undergraduates in China. Now, the population and context are different from most US high school classrooms. I think the mechanism that they identified is worth considering, especially if you teach AP level or other highly competitive courses. You might notice that some of your competitive students, the AP kids, the college-bound students working on class rank, treat AI as non-negotiable. Not because they love the tool, and in fact, we've seen survey data showing that this generation of young people has strong negative feelings about AI, but because they're anxious about falling behind if they don't use it while their peers are using it. The perception that everyone else is using it more effectively, gaining an edge with it, creates a sense of urgency, even resignation, like they have to, even if they don't particularly want to. The reason I'm bringing this up is not to say that your students are developing an AI addiction. It's really to ask, to what extent might your classroom practices, that is the way you grade, the way you talk about who succeeds, be creating an environment where students feel like AI adoption is necessary rather than optional? And if so, how might that be impacting how they approach the tool? So let's dive into the study, and then we'll talk about implications. Here's what the study found. The researchers tracked students with what they call high social comparison orientation. These are people who are habitually measuring their performance against the performance of others. They're not the usual students. This is rather in competitive academic environments where comparison orientation is basically the operating system. And this was true for me in my own high school. I was constantly comparing myself to others to see how I was stacking up literally or figuratively on the way towards my college application. I was always calibrating where I stood relative to my peers. What the researchers discovered was that the students in this orientation experience what they call an AI-specific form of FOMO. Not a fear of missing out on social experiences, which is the context in which we usually think of FOMO, but the fear of missing out on productivity and some kind of perceived technological advantage. There's an anxiety that comes with feeling that other people are getting faster, more efficient, and if you're not keeping up with their AI use, then you might be falling behind academically. It's not so much an abstract anxiety, it gets attached to a specific belief that AI is irreplaceable, that you can't function competitively without it. And once students begin to believe that, the study found that they're at higher risk of what the researchers were calling problematic use, which is defined as loss of control, continued reliance, even when they want to reduce it, a sense that they can't stop. So before we get in any further, let's just talk about a couple of caveats. One, the study's from a post-secondary population, and we're thinking here about K-12. It's from a different cultural and educational context where educational stakes and competitive pressures may certainly operate differently than in US high schools. The students in the study were self-selected Gen AI users, not a representative sample of all students. We can't assume that the mechanism works in the same way in other classrooms. And of course, some of your competitive students are using AI strategically to optimize their time and grades. And all of this is part of a rational calculation. They're thinking, if I use the tool efficiently, I can save time on lower priority work and redirect that energy to what matters for college admissions or the AP exam. We're not talking about this as dependence. That's really strategic use. But what matters is that the research suggests that in genuinely high-stakes environments where class rank is public or semi-public, for example, where college admissions depend on academic performance, where the AP exam carries real weight, the students who are already oriented towards comparison may be vulnerable to that strategic adoption becoming anxiety-driven adoption. And the anxiety-driven adoption over time can look less like deliberate choice and more like a perceived necessity. So we can't separate the psychology of how students adopt AI from the competitive pressures that your classroom creates. That is, if you're grading on a curve, if only a certain number of A's are available, you're explicitly telling students there's going to be only one way to win, and that's to do something another student isn't doing. AI could, in that circumstance, be perceived as a natural edge. If your feedback emphasizes efficiency, for example, if you mention in passing how students who use AI effectively perform better on the AP exam, then you're signaling that AI adoption is connected to success. Competitive students will receive that signal very acutely. They may not be sliding into problematic dependence as the research defines it, but they're also probably not freely choosing the tool because they think it's pedagogically sound. They're adopting it out of necessity. So if this dynamic sounds like it might fit your classroom, that is, if you teach in a high-stakes competitive environment where students are watching each other and where limited A's or public class rank creates a genuine zero-sum competition, you might want to have an explicit conversation with your students about this dynamic. You could say, look, I know you're in a competitive environment, and I know that might create pressure to use every tool at your disposal, including AI, just to stay ahead. But let's be clear about what I'm trying to do in this class. I'm not trying to pit you against one another. I'm not trying to drive you towards any particular tool. If AI is part of how we work, that's because it serves your thinking, not because you need it in order to get an A or to keep your class rank. So in addition to the conversation, you might think also, how does AI use actually look in your class? Is it allowed on certain assignments and not others? And if it is allowed, how are you defining transparent use? What are your expectations for citation? How much will they be reflecting on when they use it and what they've learned? And are there assignments designed specifically to happen without it so that they develop these skills independently? No doubt you're already thinking about this because you're engaged in AI in a thoughtful manner, but you may not be thinking about this new dynamic raised by the research. And the point isn't really to eliminate the competitive pressure. That's really built into the environment. But the point is to be transparent about what you're asking from students and why. The difference between students feeling like they have to figure out the hidden rules and students know exactly what to expect, especially around AI. The research is suggesting that in competitive environments, students who are already oriented towards comparison will be vulnerable to treating tools as irreplaceable, not out of a strategic way of thinking, but out of anxiety. So this is also going to be a dynamic to watch in institutions of higher learning, namely Harvard, which recently passed a policy limiting the number of A's, the percentage of the class that can receive an A in the class. That's going to go into effect in the fall of 2027. And this is designed to counteract the perception of grade inflation, but it is going to introduce a dynamic of a zero-sum game to a number of students who presumably are highly competitive and obviously have access to AI. So starting in fall of 2027, we will see a real-life version of this dynamic play out. So as you're hearing about this research, if you're teaching in a competitive environment, is AI showing up differently because of the environment and because of the sort of FOMO and the sense of risk that students may feel for not using the AI, even if they have, as we've said, strong negative feelings about it? Would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Please share some of your experience. And as always, thanks for taking a little time with AI in the Classroom Daily. We will see you again tomorrow.